One of the new motion control methods that's been added in the Lightwave 11 series, specifically in version 11.6, is this fella, SplineControl. SplineControl is very similar to things like Maya's Spline IK. It basically allows us to take a spline item and attach other items to it so that they follow along. Pretty simple, but best served by example, and there's certainly a number of little things that you can do with it, so we'll explore those now. First of all, let's understand where these splines come from. You don't bring them in from Modeler, there's no draw spline tool, rather you build them out of nulls. So to start with, I'm just going to add a null here. I'll just call it my spline, it can be called anything. And I'm then going to add some additional nulls which will become the control points of our spline. So 1, 2, 3 and 4 I'll call them. I'll give these a little bit of colour just to make them nice and obvious here. And the first thing to know is that you create a spline by creating a master controller, which here is the my spline, and then the actual, what we would call the node controllers, which become children of it. We'll just space these out here, so we've actually got them running along in this sort of a manner. So the first question then is, how do we actually create this spline? Well, you don't. The spline only comes into existence when something is set to be controlled by it. So I'll take our camera here and I'll set its spline control item to be the my spline. When we do that, we notice that the spline actually appears. You see that our little nulls here, 1, 2, 3 and 4, have vanished and become replaced by these little nodes or knots on the spline, and there is our spline. And we can already start to see that our camera is being controlled by it. Before we talk too much about the camera and the motion here, let's look at how the spline is constructed. You see that we have, of course, these 4 control points, these 4 knots in order there. And this is what makes the spline ordered. You'll remember back in the Foundations video we talked about the scene editor here and how you have parenting but you also have ordering depending on the order in which the items are listed. This ordering is important in the spline control as it determines the order of the knots. You'll see that if I move 4, say, somewhere here, the spline has now gone a bit wonky. You see, that has now become the second control point of the spline. Whereas, of course, if we put it back down here at the end, boom, it is back to being the last control point of the spline. What you'll also be sure not to want to do is to parent these to one another. That will not work. Notice there I parent control item number 3 off to the second null item there, and whilst item 3 is still a spline control knot, item 2 is not anymore. It has been removed, although it has become a parent of 3. So this manner of parenting spline controls to other items can still be of use, say if you wanted to have something that was offset for moving a spline point around in a manner similar to this. Let's also have a quick look at the display options here. If we go to the GL, we can see that there's options here for the spline itself. Show spline controls, curve when selected, off, ribbon when selected, curve, ribbon, etc. The ribbon draw method is interesting because it shows us this path here that we can see. It's almost as if the spline is like a little road. And we'll see why that's important in a little while. So for the minute, I'm going to leave it with ribbon draw mode on, like this. Another quick side note on the ordering of items here that instruct the spline how it is to be built is that it means that you can add items to a spline to extend it or change it very easily. So if I wanted to add another knot or another little control point in here somewhere, I don't have to parent into a chain of items and then go around repositioning all of these other ones to get the same curve beyond that point. I can just add another null, in this case called 5, stick it into the hierarchy here, either at the end, and you see I get another point out here, so I can extend my spline like that, or if I were wanting it somewhere else, I could of course have it at that point like that, allowing me to put another little piece into the spline along the midway, simply by putting it in the ordered place where I need it. Now, how to animate things along our spline. If we go back to the controllers and limits on our camera item, or whichever item here, we can see that we have controllers for the rotation and position, which are of course spline control in the same way as we would have set same as item IK or whatever else. You can, of course, in this way set SplineControl to only work on certain channels. Sometimes that's advantageous, sometimes it can be a little wonky, mostly with position. We'll see that shortly. So, how does positioning on the spline work? Well, it uses the Z value of an item. So it's Z axis. You'll notice if I drag along, it's on the spline here. If I start grabbing some of these spline knots and I move them, then we can see exactly what we're getting with our camera, dragging it along on Z there. Along it goes, following the spline. Ain't that magic? Now, what you may notice when you click the Z and drag is that sometimes, in fact quite often, working like this, you'll get a little skip or a jump in the position of the item that's on the spline. This isn't really an error, it's just a little problem that you sometimes get using the handle. You see, here's how it works. You'll notice that the Z position is set to SplineControl. Seems strange that we're then affecting the Z position on forward kinematics, essentially. Here's what's really happening. The Z, when something is on SplineControl, is no longer really the Z. It now represents the distance along the spline to be at. So if I set my Z position here to 0, we start at the beginning of the spline there. You'll notice that if I move the first spline point, the camera is still moving around with it, even of course if I come back on the Z like that. We can see that whilst my camera's absolute position there has been updated to -1.2, which is of course its parent space coordinate, it's currently at the 0 point of the spline, which of course is where I last keyed it. That's why if I now click the Z and drag, see, we get that jump because it suddenly updates to -1.2 meters, which is off the back end of the spline here. Therefore, when animating things along a spline path, it's usually best not to use the handle, but to instead use the little spinner here on the Z, or alternatively just use the graph editor directly and set your keyframes that way. Because when you key a Z position, you are not really keying a Z position, you are keying a distance along the length of the spline. And that's an important distinction to understand. For instance, let me just throw in an extra null now. I'll call this control. Now just give it a little blue colour there. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take my camera, I'm going to give it the position item of control and set the Z position controller to same as item. You'll notice that our camera does faithfully move on the Z along with our controlling item, but it has come off the spline. Its X and Y values are still being controlled by the spline here, but its Z is going awry because we are no longer animating it down the spline length. We are just animating the Z channel directly. This is the important distinction, as I mentioned. What this brings us to is the fact that this can actually be a great place to use other things, such as follower. So I'm going to take follower here, make sure that it's set to before IK, set the item to follow to be the control, turn everything to none, with the exception of the Z. And now, because it is following the Z of control before IK, and so therefore before SplineControl, I can get a nice behaviour like this, where I take a null object and I am able to drag that around in the viewport to make things move along a spline like this, rather than having to fiddle with the Z position here or fiddle with graphs. I personally like to use a little setup like this for stuff of this nature because it feels more intuitive to use. The reason that you get the little jump we saw before is because the item going along the spline outputs or reports where it actually is in its parent space on the Z, but the value that you have to enter in is different. That is the value along the spline. And so if you key things off wrong, that can cause you little problems and errors. So having something set up like this, which basically works outside of the SplineControl system, can help you immensely in having things work intuitively, and to also cause you to not have little hiccups whilst you're doing your animation that you then have to go back and correct and so on. Now, that's position. There is of course also rotation control on the spline, and we can see this is happening already as I'm dragging along. We notice that my camera there is following, it's essentially aligning itself to the path of the spline. Of course, at the moment that is coming off of the heading channel, but it will also work for the other channels. That's why you'll notice that if I bring this node up here, you see that our camera now points itself uphill. It still sticks itself and aligns itself to the spline quite nicely. This is why the ribbon mode display is nice. It gives you this idea of something being stuck on a road. And of course, as you can see, that is how it will indeed align. And it's not just in manners such as that. You'll notice that if we bank twist a spline node like this, then we can twist the road. And likewise, the item that is driving along this road will bank in accordance with that. This means that setting up things like roller coasters, train tracks, all of that sort of stuff is just super, super easy. And you can just get these things bound and working nicely and perfectly. Or of course less so, because unlike position, you can quite happily turn certain things on or off from spline control for rotation. And of course, because the rotation doesn't affect where the item is placed in space, it doesn't prevent it being stuck to the road the way that turning off the Z or the X or Y would do. We can see that we can get manual control over the orientation of the item that is following along the spline if we so choose. So that's great for a single item, but of course, as I said, trains, roller coasters, that sort of stuff. How's this going to work for multiple items? Are we going to have each, car or carriage as a separate thing and set it up with spline control and animate it itself? No, you don't. So let's take a little quick look. I'm temporarily going to turn off the IK and MC here, just so as I can get my camera back to 0 there. And then I'm going to grab my light, make it a child of the camera, and just stick it off behind the camera like that. You can see I've got it there at -1 meter, so 1 meter behind my camera. I'll now turn the IK and MC back on, so we're back in business. And you'll notice that even though I have not applied spline control to the light here, because it is a child of the camera, it inherits the spline control in this way, following along as you would expect. But if I also come to the light and I give it the spline as the spline control item, then it will stick to the spline in the same way that the camera does. How is it getting its Z position? Obviously it's not being animated, it's not following the null. It's getting it by virtue of the fact that it is a child of the camera. And so its position along the length of the spline is 1 meter less than the camera's position. So when you are trying to create chains of cars or carriages going along a track or a road or whatever else, this allows you to do it simply via parenting, and you don't need to animate each object individually. You only need to animate the lead object, and the child objects or children objects will all follow along correctly, which is a wonderful little way of controlling the whole thing. For the minute then, our spline has just been this road, but you'll notice that if instead of selecting the camera or the light, I have the motion options open and I select the My Spline item itself, this new option appears, Closed Spline. This takes our spline from being an end-to-end track and turns it into a loop. The spline after the last item jumps right back to the first one. Let me just move this around a bit to sort of clean it up, because you can see as I had it there it's a little bit knotted. So I'll put that to there, and you can see that we now have this little loop going on with twists and turns and all sorts. You can see that still with our camera having its Z at 0, which is of course is getting from this null, it is starting at the position of the first spline item, the first spline control node there, and as we drag along in distance, it just goes around and around and around and around the whole thing, following along like this. The thing to be careful of when using loops, especially if you've got twists and turns in them as we have here, is how things will handle on the bank. You can see there's the odd section there where the camera spins round and does a little flip. The reason for this is the way that the spline items are oriented. You have to orient their banks correctly, much like this where you see I've got them all in line with one another, creating a continuous smooth loop without any twists or jumps in it, and that will give you a nice smooth round and round behaviour without such popping and flipping as it goes between the last node and back to the first one again. Of course, at this point it should be obvious that we're going beyond just, roads and tracks and whatnot, and we're getting into things like caterpillar tracks for tank treads and whatnot. You can do all of that with spline control in this sort of a fashion. The other thing worth noting is what happens with bones, which are a special case for spline control. If I take a few bones there and I set all of those to the my spline, what you get in this instance is that rather than aligning to spline in the same way that an object does or an item does, a null, a camera or whatever, they align as a root to tip. A bone will always point such that its tip, however long it happens to be, or more correctly where its child position is, intersects with the spline. The result is that you get behaviour that works like this when using bones on a spline. As such, you can see that with some bone lengths, as I've got here, it gives you quite jumpy animation as the thing jumps to reach for the correct position on the spline, which is much more like a spline IK style behaviour rather than a spline motion controller. What it also means is that you can pull your spline around and things will peel back and forth along the length of that spline in this fashion when using bones on a spline control, and that can be great to do for using in certain IK setups. One such example is something that we see I've got set up here, which is a tentacle type of setup, if you will. Could be a tentacle or a tail or anything else. Now we can treat this like a special case for how to use the spline control method, because of course you'll recall that the control nulls of the spline itself can't be parented to one another, so you can't get that chain-like FK motion going on. Notice what I've done here. I've created a hierarchy of control items which are parented to one another, and then for each of the spline control items I have used the same as item control to get them attached to this little control hierarchy. This enables me to use the thing like a spline, just like this, and get this whippy sort of action going on in that fashion, but I can also use it as we might ordinarily use an FK rig, because I can FK rotate these items in sequence and the appropriate spline controllers will follow along with them, giving me this kind of behaviour. So for tails, tentacles and that sort of stuff, this works really, really well. We can even go a stage further with this, and you can start, once you've got something like this set up, snapping splines to splines. So I'll just create another one which I'll call spline 2, give that a bunch of control nulls there, and then I'm going to take this first item of my FK chain here, and guess what? Come over to its motion options and apply the spline control as spline 2, as well of course as the other items on the FK chain there, and then by grabbing the first one I can move that along the spline, and so I've got a chain of FK items here which are running on a spline. There is another spline constrained to those FK items, and then these bones are of course working off of that first spline like that. So working like this, you can start to double up your splines, build splines on splines on splines. This wonderful tool just keeps on giving, however. There's plenty more cool stuff that it has to offer. So once again, here we have a spline with a bunch of bones on it, and we can just manipulate it like that, of course. And as we see, when we move the first bone along there, the others sort of snake off along the trail like this. However, check this out. If we select all of the bones here and we pop over the motion options, then of course we see that we have this option, spline fit. At the minute, it's set to linear distance. And this is the standard mode we've seen, where you animate a Z value for how far along a spline something is. Of course, if you've got a hierarchy, as we have here with the bones, they all carry along. However, you can also fit to spline. In this case, we take the items and they get fitted along the length of the spline. So you'll notice that if I take the first item here and I start animating its Z value up and down, you'll see that the item at the end of the chain there stays in place, and I can compress and stretch this hierarchy out. In this case, the parent positions, or the parent relative positions of each child item in the chain are being updated to help the chain fit along the spline between its end point and whatever value along the spline I have the first item. You'll notice, of course, that I did that for all items. You can toggle this per item, so if I set that middle one there back to linear distance, then you see it maintains its regular distance from its parent like that, and that becomes an offset in the spline fitting behaviour in this manner. That may have casual use from time to time, but the majority of the time you would have it on all items like this. And in a case like this, it effectively turns the spline even more like an IK system, because of course the end item is fixed, just as you would fix the end item of an IK chain to, a goal position or similar. Of course, you will remember, I hope, the things that we talked about both back in the space video and which we also re-referenced in the IK video, when you've got a chain of items that you want to be able to stretch and squash, and how you don't want to use scale on the items because the scale is inherited parent to child all the way down the chain, and you generally, when you're doing, stretchy IK, you tend to use position instead. This is pretty much analogous to that. It allows you to effectively build a stretchy chain on a spline in a very similar way to that which we did with, stretchy IK, except of course, spline method rather than direct IK method. There is also other cool stuff that we can do with the spline control, and for this example I've just got, 3 little spline items there, so it's forming just a very basic curve or line, and a set of little boxes because they help to demonstrate this nice and easily. What I can also use SplineControl for, or rather exploit it for, is to help me create distributed twist, because of course we can align the banks of items to the spline. Getting distributed twist down a hierarchy, a chain, whether that be bones or objects or anything else, can be, tricksy in Lightwave at times. SplineControl makes this a snap. What I can even do is take something like my second mid control null here. I can give it the rotation item of the end null there, of course set its bank to same as item and multiply it by half, and that of course allows me to distribute twist all the way down the chain in this fashion. Couple that with fit to spline and we can get a squashy, stretchy distribution of twist down a spline area, just like this, enabling some really fun and funky effects to work that way. This of course is, great for doing trains or of course roller coasters, where as something goes round a loop, of course each carriage is distributing the twist along. But of course if you think about it, this stretchy behaviour combined with distributed twist, you do this on bones, and with a very little amount of thought, it's not hard to see how you can start turning this into ribbon style IK to produce bendy, flexy limbs on cartoon characters, which will maintain nice IK style stretching as well as IK style twisting. There you have it, SplineControl. Very versatile little control method available to us that we can use with all sorts of items, be they objects, bones, joints, or so on. And of course, allowing us to rig up anything from trains to tentacles to tails and the like.